Interesting. Professor, what is this sounds like a very interesting book. It Can Happen Here, White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the US. What does that book deal with?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. It goes back to 2015, right? I got the summons at the court. Donald Trump was becoming a viable candidate for presidency. I was, on the week that I testified in Cambodia, the meme, Trump is like Hitler was the meme of the week. When the National Public Radio labeled it that, this analogy was going everywhere. There were fears of authoritarianism. As a scholar, I'm always very wary of quick, easy analogies. But certainly in terms of the demonization of non-whites in the US and also non-white outsiders, including people, quote unquote, called terrorists. He referred to Mexican rapists, drug lords, so on and so forth. This language of insiders, outsiders, of a pure community under threat by a dangerous, contaminating outsider was very much being mobilized. Now, he wasn't the first one to do this. There's a long history of this language being deployed in the US, but Donald Trump is very charismatic. He can bring, crowds to a roar. He can inspire them. He's a very charismatic person. And that also was something that's very alarming to someone who studies mass violence and history. So he had some of these qualities and messaging that I found very alarming. And I said, well, I'll probably write about it. At some point, then he became president, of course, shocking many people. And then soon after that, we had Charlottesville. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with Charlottesville. Do I need to tell the history?
You can probably tell the story.
Yeah, there's a long history of white power extremism, white supremacy in the US, going all the way back to the foundations of the country. It's changed through time. I talk about this in the book. Especially after the civil rights movement, you begin to get notions of victimization and subjugation, and the notion of white genocide, which I know also circulates in South Africa as well, and often through the Great Replacement idea that we see in Europe in many different contexts. That language was certainly began to be more foregrounded. And there have been a number of white power militias. Timothy McVeigh blew up of an FBI building, famously modeling his attack on the Turner Diaries, which is people have called it white supremacist scripture. Anyways, I'm going to digress too much into a lot of this history, but we've had this long tradition of these groups being active. They, at different times, their numbers will increase and then decrease. And they actually increased greatly during when Obama was president in the US. Most people don't really know about that. So the numbers are already high coming in, but they also, a lot of these groups are really galvanized when Donald Trump became president, because he effectively was playing upon white genocide discourses, played upon white grievance, white victimization. And so, I don't want to say there's a moment of euphoria, but certainly elevated expectations of a number of these groups. So Richard Spencer, the person who coined the term alt-right, for example, he was in Washington at the time, and he did a Hail Trump salute that was, famously circulated around the world, I expect, in the media. So he was one of the organizers of a rally in Charlottesville that brought together, originally it was going to be the alt-right, and what we might call the far hard right, which are the sort of neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan, and other actors. But we had this new group called the alt-right, a new term, and Spencer claims, sometimes takes credit for having invented that term. Their platform is that race is real, the Jewish question is valid, and the white genocide has taken place. They had a book that came out that sort of said that this is the essence of our platform. So they had this rally. The alt-right pulled out because I think the far hard right were involved, the most extreme elements, but still a number of white power actors, ranging from members of the alt-right to KKK and other white power actors showed up in Charlottesville, held a rally. One person was killed, and many, they had wiki torches they marched with. They chanted blood and soil. They chanted, Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us, with that replacement language. And this was, a major event in sort of US history. And people suddenly said, what is going on? And at that point, again, I've been thinking about writing about this, this language of white genocide, the language of race war, the echoes and mobilization of Nazi language were such that I said, I'm going to write about this, and I'm also going to teach about it. And so the book actually is written in sort of a temporal progression, and it sort of tells the story of my teaching and thinking through the events that were taking place in the US. And I should note that the worries back in 2015 certainly began to seem much more warranted and alarming by the time we got to 2018. And at that point, I had a class I was teaching, genocide and mass atrocity, and people used a UN framework of analysis that looked at risk factors for genocide. And students were working with this risk assessment platform. And after a shooting at a synagogue, Tree of Life massacre in the US, we said, well, let's take it and apply it to the US. And it was fairly alarming that actually the level of risk of atrocity crimes in the US was relatively high already. And those risk factors only amplified and hyped up as we moved to 2020. And they were sky high by the time we got to the January 6th insurrection in the US. And the US was on the cusp of atrocity crimes if things had played out in different sorts of ways. So the book follows, it looks at the history of white power extremism in the US, systemic white supremacy. It looks at the immediate history of how this manifests under Trump. It looks at how political leaders mobilize language like white grievance, victimization, to stir people up. It also considers social media, which is an absolutely critical factor in the ability to mobilize people. Also for people are in these, the famous bubbles, but it's true. Left, right, or center, people are in these bubbles where they hear the messages of what they sort of believe about the world. And it's a real problem. I myself always try and listen in the US, it'd be Fox News, Wall Street Journal, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, what have you. I always try and look at a spectrum, including some fairly far right sites as well. And everyone should be doing that. And I always tell my students to go do it because the messages, this is one aside. So in the US, until we recently had this R v. Wade controversy that broke out with the Supreme Court a couple of days ago took place, if you turned on CNN or MSNBC, Ukraine was a story. If you went to Fox News, the war wasn't in Ukraine, the war was on the border, right, with illegal immigration. That's the war. So there's like these completely different understandings of what's going on. And of course, you think about threat. In one case, it's Russia, sort of through this Cold War geopolitical threat lens, danger of nuclear war. And another one, it's this great replacement fear of non-white others coming in and taking over the US. And, there's a daily occurrence. So again, the book considers the sort of thought bubbles, how people, sort of get caught up in the rhetorics of white genocide, great replacement language. And it's not a small number of people. I should note that there are a number of different studies, but we're talking about tens of millions of people in the US. If they're not necessarily members of the far hard right or the alt-right, but they're people to whom that message, with whom it resonates. And that's highly alarming. And what it means is basically the US, and I would say this is actually true in many different countries. You can actually even look at Germany, for example, where they found that there's this high proliferation of neo-Nazi sympathizing officials, and the police and the different parts of the government. I mean, most people aren't aware of this. but it's widespread. It doesn't mean everyone is a neo-Nazi, but it's this, right? These rhetorics that resonate with people. And so, what's the situation in the US now? We're still not in a very good situation. There's an enormous amount of polarization. We have the specter of the charismatic demagogue, Donald Trump, returning. He's been banned from Twitter, but he has his own social media platform now, Truth Social, and we'll see if it works. But we'll see if Elon Musk continues and buys Twitter, and if he does, if he lets Trump have his 80 million Twitter followers back. Twitter is astounding how Trump was basically a master of Twitter in the way that he messaged and communicated with people. Anyways, these are all things I consider in the book. I've gone on too long talking about it because it's still a fresh project and very directly relevant, not just to the US, but to white power extremism in the world. And I do talk about these sort of global circuits of white power extremism as well.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. Donald Trump has said that even if Elon Musk offers him to join Twitter again, he says he's not going to do it. He's going to stick to Truth Social, or at least that's what I've heard.
Yeah, you're right. That's what he says. He wants to make money.
Yeah. Professor,
so that's his platform, so he can make money off it. But I guarantee you, if his platform doesn't do well, he'll grab onto Twitter and use it.
Yeah,
I have no doubt about that.
Professor, have you read True Believer by Eric Hoffer, where he talks about the psychology of mass movements? It's a very interesting book, and obviously, okay, you also know it, that where he talks about it's intellectuals that usually pave the way for a mass movement. For example, he cited Germany, where he says that it's a person like Ludendorff and the Kaiser Wilhelm that said the reason why we lost the First World War was because of Jews. And that sort of energy led to the rise of a person like Hitler. Hitler didn't create the situation, he merely harnessed it. And it doesn't seem to me there's a similar situation in the United States, to the same degree. So I know, for example, you mentioned Charlottesville, but were there only 1,000 people that were so-called Nazis that attended that event? And I think after George Floyd was killed or murdered, there was a poll that showed 70% of the people in the United States support Black Lives Matter. And of course, anyone who believes one race is less than another race, that should be condemned. But it just doesn't seem to me there's that same sort of something that can lead to a Holocaust that you saw in pre-Nazi Germany.
That's a great point and a sort of big issue that you bring up. And again, I don't want to give a long answer to it, but I think it's important to underscore, well, first of all, that white power extremism is global, and the thought leaders are in connection with one another. They're in the US, there's a stereotype, sometimes we talk about this as Southern exceptionalism, where the portrayal of far-right extremists is that they're from the South, they live in rural areas, they're not very intelligent, they're kind of backwards. There's absolutely nothing to be further from the truth. The white power extremists, I'm in New Jersey, where Rutgers University is located. We've got lots of white power extremist groups. I could drive half an hour and I'd be in sort of right by one of the major ones in New Jersey. They're all over the place. They're intellectuals who lead the movement, who produce ideas. I mentioned before, I don't want to mention the book because I don't really want to recommend it to anyone, but they published a manifesto. And the people who wrote in this manifesto of the alt-right were people who had advanced degrees. They are the intellectual leaders of this movement. And there are many other people with whom they now communicate, interact throughout the world. So absolutely, white power extremism definitely has thought leaders. You can look at, in the US, at the sort of conservative movement, and you can find many highly educated people. I don't want to say conservatives, but people who had sort of far-right extremist, white power extremist valences to what they were talking about. You can find a number of highly educated people who were promoting this. So I would say absolutely the thought leaders are there. and they're very much in the center. In fact, one of the sort of concepts that they pioneered, this guy named Overton, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Overton window, but it's this idea that you need to shift the boundaries of what's acceptable speech so that what formerly was taboo becomes acceptable. And under Trump, so people, the far right intellectual leaders, white power extremist intellectual leaders, talk about this idea of shifting the Overton window. And they did shift the Overton window. They talk about, and this is global, the notion of metapolitics. The idea of metapolitics, there's a belief, and again, so far right extremists read the Frankfurt School of philosophy. They think that they're a bunch of quote unquote cultural Marxists, right? So they're reading philosophy, critical theory. They're mobilizing critical theory. And one of their key beliefs is that actually you had the Frankfurt School with Adorno, Horkheimer, and these other philosophers who were Jewish, most of them, that they wanted to basically brainwash people because often it's a Jewish-led conspiracy that they believe is behind the attempt to eradicate the white race, that tried to do thought control and make it so people couldn't have sort of extremist beliefs. So if you want to teach people about tolerance, that's a modality of thought control and brainwashing for white power extremists. So they said, well, we're going to engage in our own metapolitics, and we're fighting a battle for minds ultimately. And so we have to do things like shift the Overton window and to take ideas that have been tabooed and banned by quote unquote cultural Marxists and make them acceptable. And you know what? Under the Trump administration, they moved the Overton window. Trump himself moved the Overton window. And so if you sort of look, in the US, and, this is true globally, I think, with what people can say, we can just look at the great replacement discourses that circulated in the French election. Out in the open, front and center, right? Which they used to be taboo. Marie Le Pen's now a moderate, which is shocking, right? But anyway, so I'm digressing, but the point is that this window has moved and the boundaries of what it's acceptable to say has shifted in the US. And this also lays a sort of basis in the future for future dangers of white power extremism to again sort of rise up and increase the danger of having political violence, civil war, mass violence. It's not to say it's going to occur tomorrow, but it's there. That potentiality is there. And the one other point I would underscore, again, going back, is that the US has committed atrocity crimes. Most of US history involved the enslavement of Blacks. US history involves the dispossession through settler colonialism of indigenous lands. US history includes the concentrating Japanese Americans, right? And basically concentration camps. US history, I could go on a long time. Guantanamo, war, imperial wars, there's a long history of atrocity crimes. So the idea that there's a possibility that atrocity crimes can take place shouldn't be surprising. They have taken place. And it makes it incumbent upon all of us, wherever we live throughout the world, with all of our different histories, to continually be aware and on the look for signs that something that, this sorts of violence might take place again. That's maybe we kind of come back full circle to the beginning of our discussion, where this is why it's important to understand what these things are, right? When we talk about genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, to understand the definitions of the concepts, to understand the dynamics and drivers and the risk factors for them. Because if we're not watching for those, right, then this stuff comes out of the blue. So that's, you sort of say, maybe your very first question was, how did I start to study this stuff? And I sort of talked about that. And this is where I am now, where I'm trying to mobilize this knowledge in part for prevention and to write publicly about things that are often written about in smaller sort of academic scholarly circles, and to take these ideas and communicate them. And you mentioned before, so during this, recently I published 2 articles in The Conversation and an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times about this immediate, the Ukraine, atrocity crimes in Ukraine. But it's something that I think most scholars, we need to be writing in general about. So I write about it in the US. I'll write about it in Russia's atrocity crimes in Ukraine, and I will continue to do so in the future in other localities. And I encourage everyone, wherever you are, study this stuff, be aware, and also spread awareness.